Right, so our next presenter is Katharine Burgess. And even though I am an historian, this one really stretched me out of my comfort zone. When she came to me with this idea, I was like, okay, this is really cool, I think, if I understand. So that took a little bit of time for me, and it's the drawings. Okay, that was really important in a lot of our conversations. Cure paper showed me. But Katharine has a fascination with aircraft, which is really cool. She really loves to learn about airplanes and all of the different functions and purposes of aircraft. And the Vietnam War aircraft that she is going to talk about today is one that she found particularly fascinating. It was a very interesting study. It was interesting to work with her on this. Getting information about classified weaponry is not easy. So she had these great resources, bless you, of pilots that actually flew these planes, or naval officers who were on the carriers. So she found a lot of information that way. But a lot of the questions we would come to would be, well, we don't have an engineer with classified clearance to ask these questions of. But there was lots of great information that she could find with us, and I think she did an excellent job with this project. And I learned way more about aircraft, aircraft weaponry, jet propulsion, wing shapes than I ever thought I would know. So it was a good experience for that too. But Katharine's done a wonderful job. She also presented this this project in the fall at Snickers, and did an excellent job there before it was complete. And so I'm really happy that you all are here to hear the complete project.
Right, hello everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Palmadessa, for the lovely introduction. So, as I said, I'm Katharine Burgess, and I am presenting my honors thesis titled "The Phantoms of Our Past." Thank you, Rachel, for the idea. Help. And that is the technological advancement of the F-4 Phantom in the Vietnam War. So before I want to get too far into this, I want to make a quick acknowledgement. The F-4 Phantom was a weapon of war. It was responsible for taking human lives. But the positive to that is it did, protect the pilots that were flying them, and maybe in the end saved more than it took. So I also would like to show you what I'm talking about, so you're not questioning everything I'm saying. So here in the upper left-hand corner, that is an F-4 Phantom that is a Navy model. I am focusing specifically on the F-4 Phantom that was used in the US Navy. It was adapted for other branches, but since it was developed for the Navy, that is what my focus is on. The photo on the bottom is a F-4 Phantom that was adapted for the Air Force. But I wanted to show you this so you could see just how large these aircraft are. So it takes a ladder, as you can see here, for the two crewmen to even get in. And you can see them crawling in there. So with perspective to a average human body, that is how big these aircraft are. And then in the upper right-hand corner is a US Navy carrier ship. So this is what these aircraft would be launching from and landing on. So you can see here, they don't have a whole lot of space to launch from, and these aircraft had to be launched with what was called a cat shot, and that's essentially a plane slingshot to get them off of the aircraft. Okay. So the research questions that were guiding this study was why was this technology developed for the Vietnam War? So what was special about this that needed new technologies? And then how were the three classifications of aircraft, being fighter, bomber, and long-range interceptor, all utilized together to create the F-4 Phantom? And then lastly, why was the F-4 Phantom decommissioned if it was an effective weapon of war? So a little bit of historical context before I get into the plain stuff. So the geography of North Vietnam was unfamiliar to the United States military. Jungle terrain wars have not been fought previously. So that meant that there needed to be new military tactics to adjust to these changing conditions. At the time of the Vietnam War, the United States was mid-transition from propeller aircraft to jet aircraft. So what the F-4 was actually one of the earliest jets to be implemented by the US Navy. And the Vought F-4U Corsair was the last propeller to be phased out. So we had both propeller and jet aircraft kind of going together in the early stages of this war. So the Vietnam War was uncensored. It was on the televisions. So the average American household had a television where they could see what was happening. So this meant that the Vietnam War didn't really have a great approval rating from the people. So that added a pressure to make something positive out of this. And that is why I think the Phantom may have been that was positive that came from this. So naval aviation was one of the ways that the United States military tried to stay ahead of the competition. So they really had to compete with Soviet aircraft, which before this point, before the development, the Soviets were kind of beating us on that front. And also, another new issue for naval aviation are the carrier ships. Jets need a long runway to take off and land from, and that is not really going to have a lot of space on a carrier ship. So you had to be very precise with your takeoff speeds and to make sure that you weren't going to overshoot, fall off the edge of the ship. That would not be good. So Operation Rolling Thunder was the big campaign that the F-4 Phantoms were involved with, and the objective of the Rolling Thunder campaign was to push the line of North Vietnam back into North Vietnam by a series of attacks. So ultimately, Operation Rolling Thunder was unsuccessful, but I believe that the Phantom success extended beyond Operation Rolling Thunder. All right, so some background on the F-4 Phantom. It was developed by McDonnell Aircraft Corporation. Now you might notice that the F-4 Phantom is actually called the McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell and Douglas did not merge together until 1967, so that was after the initial development of the F-4 Phantom. So McDonnell had tried several times to win a Navy contract, and it was unsuccessful. So McDonnell decided to try a different approach from the lightweight fighter crafts to a heavier long-range interceptor. So the F-4 Phantom was going to fit the need for the Navy's need to protect the carrier ships from the enemy aircraft. The F-4 Phantom was adapted over a period of time to multiple branches. In the multiple branches, what they did was it made minor changes to the aircraft to fit what they needed. So the Air Force ones didn't really need such a short take-up speed. And one of the debates at the time was what wing shape was going to be optimal for fighter jets. So I have here my little doodles. So right here, we have the straight wing. And at this point, it was pretty much already known that a straight wing configuration was out. That is what was most common among propeller aircraft. So it really came down to the sweep and the variable sweep, and then the delta. So the variable sweep, this one's a little wonky, but that's okay. So it could actually be configured to a relatively straight wing, and then it could also be swept back to a high sweep wing. So that would be able to adjust their maneuverability and to be more aerodynamic depending what the situation was. And then the delta wing is relatively triangular. They most of the time were not perfect triangles, but they were based roughly on a triangular shape. The F4 Phantom did end up going with a delta wing configuration, but it actually had bent wings on the end, so it wasn't a perfectly flat triangular shaped wing. The variable sweep was pretty common with most other aircraft being developed, but sometimes that appeared to be less sustainable than the delta wing configuration. Okay, so data and analysis. So to collect my data, as Dr. Palmadessa mentioned, I didn't really have a lot of access to classified materials. So my main source were books from the pilots that flew these aircrafts, or from people that had a close relationship to the aircraft in the Vietnam War. And actually, I had one book who, he must have known that someone was going to write a thesis about this one day, because he answered almost everything that I needed. So I also had to collect some additional data from secondary sources, but mostly from primary sources from pilots. And once I got that data, I coded it into the categories of which data would fit to answer which research question. And then I would compare each source and together formulate a complete answer to my research questions. So this is more of a historical analysis rather than quantitative or anything like that. So my discussion of findings. My first research question, why this technology? So the Navy planners suspected that dogfighting was not going to be commonplace in the Vietnam War. So, which turned out to not be entirely accurate. Because of the jungle terrain, it was suspected that a missile or a bomb, something that could cover a larger target area, would be more profitable. So when developing the F4 Phantom, the guns were not put on the aircraft. But it is still classified partially as fighter because it had air-to-air missile capability. So in a dogfighting situation, the F4 Phantom could use an air-to-air missile to get itself out of that situation. So that is why it is partially classified as that. So guns were still used in the Vietnam War, but it just was not on the F4 Phantoms. And since the Navy suspected that the dogfighting days were over, aircraft maneuverability was not placed at a top priority. So the F4 Phantom, being heavier, was much less maneuverable than a lightweight fighter-craft. So, as I said, even though they didn't have guns, they were able to use missiles to survive in those situations. So the main priority for the F4 Phantom and why this technology was needed for the Vietnam War was that the Soviets had advanced their technology, and we needed to protect the carrier ships from those Soviet attacks. So we needed something. The primary objective was a long-range interceptor to take down those Soviet aircraft before they could even get on radar to the ship. From their radar, not from our radar. So the F4 Phantoms could use their radars to detect Soviet aircraft and shoot them down before they could get close to a carrier ship. But I'm going to share with you my favorite piece of data that I gathered on this question from a pilot who is both in the Navy and the Air Force. And he had an interesting perspective of why that guns were not used on this aircraft. he suspected that the Navy planners would rather, quote, collectively eat a bug than adopt a US Air Force gun system. End quote. So he suspected that the rivalry between the Air Force and the Navy was part of the reason why the Navy decided to leave guns behind. And considering that this whole project, I found so much drama, surprisingly, that it wouldn't surprise me that that could be part of the reason. So my second research question, this was very dense to work through. I got a lot of logistical reasons for why and how these technologies were able to be used together. I'm not going to go through all of that today because that would require much more doodle space. But the biggest thing was utilizing 2 crewmen on board rather than just 1. With 2, there was able to be 1 who could be primarily concerned with flying, and then 1 who is primarily concerned with the weapon systems. This did cross over a little bit. The pilots would have to do a little bit of weapons manning, but that was not their primary concern. So another big thing for how this was possible was where the controls were positioned. They were positioned so closely together that it was able to all fit in one thing. Now, an issue with that was using the wrong switch in a attack setting. So the missiles and the bombs actually had separate trigger switches. So, one of the pilots could have mistakenly, say, launched a missile when they were trying to launch a bomb. But the gun sight, ironically enough, it was called that even though there were no guns. That is where it could be configured to which weapon systems were going to be deployed. And then also the radar was placed in the nose of the aircraft. So this aircraft relied a lot on radars. The bombs that were equipped on the F-4 Phantom were not able to be targeted. They were completely manual. So the pilots actually had to have a correct angle of dive, which was actually about 40 degrees down, launch the bomb after the target was placed, and it had to be at the exact right time or it would go too far or fall too short. And with that, had to be moving at the correct speed. Otherwise, the target was not going to line up anywhere. And the most important thing when these weapon systems were deploying was to immediately angle back up so the plane would not catch any of its own explosion or anything. So, pretty delicate stuff. With this, the aircraft used a lot of fuel because this is pretty heavy. Because it could hold, I believe, 9 either combinations of missiles, bombs, and you could adjust that. That would be placed underneath the wings. So the Phantom used a whole lot of fuel to be able to do this. And then also with keeping its speed up, in this, there was a device called the afterburner ring. And what that did was essentially dump fuel directly into the engines to get kind of a power up speed. And with doing that, that would use even more fuel and that would decrease the flying range of these aircrafts. So how did we combat that problem? There was a tanker aircraft on a helicopter that was able to attach to the Phantoms with a hose and bucket. And that actually had to be guided by the tanking aircraft because from the pilot's perspective on the Phantom, they would overshoot how much they need to move to line that up. And lastly, for how this was done together with the takeoff and landing procedures, the Phantom had a tendency to pitch up, which increased the risk of a stall An engine stall is essentially the engine just completely shuts down. And luckily there were 2 engines on board, so it wouldn't be entirely detrimental to lose 1 engine in flight. But the tendency to pitch up was typically when launching off of the carrier ship. So with that, there was not really an opportunity to recover from a stall when launching. So the pilots had to be really careful to keep a strong hold on the control stick, keep it slightly forward, and the takeoff speed was actually only 15 knots above stall speed. So taking off was extremely precise for these pilots. The pilots are really what make it work, and they had to receive very in-depth training of how to handle this. And from Kenneth Volker, one of the pilots I read, he said that a lot of trainees dropped out from how extensive and from how delicate the training for the F-4 Phantoms were. My last research question, why was it decommissioned? So unfortunately, I could not find any sources that directly answer this question, but I have a couple of suspicions for why that was. First of all, the cost of fuel, since this used so much fuel compared to other aircraft. It was not necessarily more expensive to build these, but once you take into consideration how much fuel they would use, they would end up being more expensive in the long run. And then the second reason is they were just simply phased out. This was the basis for a lot of aircraft later on to base their technologies off of the F-4 Phantom. Moving forward, not many, or I don't even know of one that used everything that was on the F-4 Phantom. So simply it was taken out by newer, better aircraft, which is just going to happen. But it did have a career in the military across 3 branches, ranging 30 to 40 years, if you consider all 3 branches. It was decommissioned eventually in 1996. And my conclusion would be that the F-4 Phantom was developed for the changing naval tactics that were unique to the Vietnam War. Its technologies were delicately put together to create one advanced weapon of war, and that the technological advancements of the F-4 Phantom in the Vietnam War allowed for newer and more advanced aircraft even after its time in service. And like I said, it was used in multiple US military branches and had a very long career. And some other countries did adapt this aircraft. I don't know too much about that, but in some places it is still being used. All right. Does anyone have any questions for me? Yes.
I should remember this. What interested you in this aircraft in particular? Because I remember you coming in and you were very excited that you did have a primary source. Maybe that's the person you mentioned. I'm sure it is the person you mentioned earlier. So tell me quickly about that, because that was really exciting.
So my reason for this aircraft was the McDonnell Aircraft Corporation, their persistence with the US Navy. They had been rejected time and time again. So they said, essentially, we're like, okay, Navy, take this. I'll show you. I can make something that will fit one of your demands. So that was one of the points of drama that I was talking about earlier. Yes.
Very kind of basic question, but what got you interested in aircraft in general?
Okay, funny story. I grew up absolutely terrified of airplanes, and I started to research them so I would not be afraid of them anymore. So once I understood how they worked, I got over that fear, and then that sparked, my interest in wanting to know more about it.
Nice. Okay.
So I know you were talking about technological advancements, and I'm just wondering, and this could be outside your research topic, but I wonder if the development of the F4 Phantom had any sort of contributions to, say, commercial aircraft, because the Concorde was developed like not long after the Phantom came out, and not far away from us, there's a supposed Concorde successor that is under development that's supposed to bring jobs into the region. So I'm just wondering, in your research or in your estimation, whether there's some technologies that made the crossover into the non-military aircraft application.
I did not come across anything, but since it was such a heavy aircraft, I suspect that maybe some of that of how to keep such a heavy thing up in the air, maybe that would have crossed over. Yes.
I'm just, fill out this picture for me a little bit. You were saying that the McConnell was working to, try to provide something that kept on failing, or that kept on getting rejected.
Yes.
So was their response of the F4 Phantom, was that the company taking in, the Navy was saying, no, that's not gonna work. We need this. No, that's not gonna work. We need this. And they put their heads together at the company and said, okay, they say we need this, 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 and this. Let's put it all together.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
they probably didn't go.
Right. Well, I would think that maybe they did. But, yes, they had failed at multiple contracts, so they tried to take something from each one and put it together. Initially, I think they were only going to go for 2 of the aircraft classifications, but then they said, you know what? Let's just put it all together, see if we can do it. Okay.
Is the rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force still a thing nowadays?
I'm not sure, but at least from a higher up perspective, but I know that service members I know will give each other a hard time over Navy and Air Force. I've commonly heard someone refer to the Air Force as the chair force. So I would say that rivalry is still going, at least with the service members.
Yeah, I'll say my neighbor, she's a technology commission Air Force pilot, that I had mentioned this project to her, and I said something about, you haven't served as a naval pilot, and she's like, yeah. I'm not a naval pilot, I was in the Air Force, I got it, so.
Yeah.
That was a read.
Yeah.
Yes, Nick.
How special was the long career that the Phantom had? Was it like really an outlier compared to the careers of other aircraft technology?
It was relatively an outlier. I wouldn't say it was a crazy difference. But for a lot of its career, it was used as training jets. So that's why I would maybe not say it's incredibly unique. It wasn't really facing combat the entire time. It did face combat into the 90s, but after that it was used to train pilots. And actually a lot of the times in training, it would be unmanned and the training pilots would have to shoot down the Phantoms out of the air. So that's how a lot of them went out. There's not a whole lot of them left because of that.
So somebody would set it off manually by itself into the air to operate as a target?
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
Talk about getting phased out. Right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's where you can personally go see one, like in museums.
Yes, there is. I'm not sure exactly all of the locations, but
Arizona.
there's I believe there might be one also in Maryland. There's some at some bases that are still where you can access them, but you would have to, for a lot of these, get a special permission to go on base to see them for the ones that are in museums.
And I should probably, give a public, who's not here, thank you to Dr. Jeremy Kenny, who's a alum of the college who we contacted up front.
Yeah.
Because he was an aircraft preservationist, he's in charge of the K exhibits and so again. So he was able to connect her with some resources.
Yes, he was a big help, especially earlier on in the process. Anything else? Okay, well, thank you all very much.